Well, hey everybody, thank you for checking in once again and welcome to another one. Outside it is rainy and grey today, but in here life is beautiful because I've got 5 Nikon vintage lenses to show you today. This was the first Nikon lens I bought and it's sitting here actually on the first Nikon camera I bought. It's the 50mm f1.4 Nikon lens and it's sitting on the very beautiful Nikon FE all mechanical SLR camera. Now this is a really lovely lens. As I say, it was the first Nikon lens that I ever bought and I was very impressed by this lens. I'd shot a lot of other vintage 51.4s before I came to this one. This one impressed me with its colour palette. It has very extraordinary colours. It emphasises blues and greens and it gives this sort of petrol-y blue look to foliage when the light is right. It's got very, very interesting coatings which give it a sort of a purpley red flares coming through the glass. It's nice and sharp from wide open, at least as sharp as any vintage 51.4 can be, but it is sharp enough to shoot wide open and not show or see any significant softness, certainly in the centre of your shot. The corners are a little different, but wide open you can shoot this lens for a very nice aesthetic effect. It's got beautiful background blur as well. The blur is very lovely. Like a lot of vintage lenses, or even most vintage lenses, it can turn a little harsh now and again, but it's easy to shoot around. That's no problem. Just adjust your distances a little. Most vintage lenses will exhibit some harshness in their background blur, but this one generally has very, very nice, very lovely blur. Shall we have a look at the lens a bit more closely? Okay then, let's do that. And there it is, lovely and vintage and metal. There you can see the colours of the coatings. They're sort of browny red and purpley blue kind of colour. All of the lenses I'm going to show you today are all metal. Pretty much all Nikon lenses are all metal, with the exception of some of the Series E lenses, which I believe did use some plastic. Everything turns nicely on this lens. It probably could do with a little extra grease by now. It's about 50 years old, but it's still fine. There's no roughness. Everything moves nicely. Apertures run from f1.4 to the other end, whatever that is, f16. So we've got the full range of aperture adjustments there. A very, very nice lens and one that stood the test of time really well. They do tend to stand up to conditions pretty well as long as they're treated reasonably well, because these are very well made lenses. So it's a lovely lens that you can shoot wide open. It's got great colours and it's got nice blur. It gets a little bit sharper. In fact, it gets a lot sharper if you stop it down by f5.6. It's very, very sharp indeed, but you do sacrifice a little of that wonderful blur if you do that. I think probably the sweet spot for this lens is f2.8, and if you want the maximum blur, if you're doing a portrait, then go for f1.4. That will give you the maximum background blur for counterpointing your portraits, your subjects in your portraits. One area where this lens falls down a little bit in comparison to lenses from other manufacturers, and this I've seen repeated actually generally across the range of Nikon lenses that I've shot, is chromatic aberration. It really is particularly bad in this one. It doesn't show itself in general day-to-day photography, but it will make itself shown if you're shooting dark objects against the sky. For example, tree branches against the sky, they will show a little bit of separation of colour, and that's because optical flaws in the lens mean that the various colours focus at slightly different points, and that's what the cause of chromatic aberration is. This lens does have quite a bit of it. It doesn't bother me, it never troubles me at all. If it troubles you, you can remove it in post. It's not too difficult to do. But yeah, that is an area where it does show less good performance than quite a lot of other vintage 51.4s. Doesn't bother me. If it troubles you, remove it in post and you're fine. I think overall this is a really nice lens. It's got great colour, it's sharp, it's got lovely background blur, and it's got that really unique colour palette, which is, you know, really is something to write home about in my book. Some of the other Nikon lenses show it. One or two of the others that I'm going to show you show it, but this one shows it the most. So a very unusual lens for colour, and a very nice lens indeed. If you're not looking for an f1.4 lens, then this lens will do pretty much just as well, and it's by no means a second best. This is a very, very nice lens in its own right. This is the 50mm f2. Nikon 50mm f2. This one dates from, I believe, the late 70s sometime, but like a lot of these Nikon lenses, this one was made right from 1959 right up until the late 70s. And do correct me if I'm wrong, because I may be wrong, but I believe a version of this lens is still made today in autofocus form, but do correct me if I'm wrong. I was extremely impressed by this lens. It makes beautiful images, and it's quite a bit less expensive than the 51.4. The blur is just as nice. There's not quite as much of it because you don't have that f1.4 aperture that you can really open up wide and maximize your blur to the potential of f1.4, but you do get an f2 lens, and that can make plenty of blur anyway. And after all, how much blur do you need? If you go fairly close with this lens, you'll get loads and loads of blur, far more than you could ever decently require. So this is a very, very good alternative, not a second best, but a very good alternative to the 51.4 if you don't need a 1.4. And there's the lens, and you can see it's got similar coatings, sort of bluey, greeny coatings. We don't see the bronzy colour, browny bronzy colour there that we did in the 51.4, but it does have that bluey sort of coating. This is a really nice lens. It's a lot lighter and a lot smaller than the 51.4. This one's in really nice condition. Again, everything turns nicely and freely and smoothly. Minimum focus distance is 45 centimeters. That's about standard-ish for an SLR lens, and that goes all the way up to infinity, of course. Apertures run from f2 to f16, so we've got the range of aperture values there, but just without that f1.4 value, which, you know, 9 times out of 10, 8 times out of 10, you're not really going to need as such. I don't know how many aperture blades this one has. The 51.4 had 7. This one has, let me count them, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So this one has, oops, sorry. So this one has 6 aperture blades, so you will see hexagons if you stop down in the background blur. I rather like hexagons in the background blur, but not everybody does. If you don't want to see them, keep the lens wide open. So this is a really lovely lens, and it made some really lovely images. It doesn't show quite the same colour palette as the 51.4. It doesn't pump up the blues and the greens in quite the same way. Instead, this lens has an altogether lighter, more joyous feel. They're fun, they're exuberant, they're like a splash of water in a pool on a summer day, if that's not a bit too much. But they are very, very lovely colours, and I was very impressed by them. I just love what this lens can do with colour. A very sharp image from wide open, lots of sharpness, certainly in the centre of the lens. The corners are a bit softer, and like all vintage lenses, it gets sharper when you stop down, and it's really sharp by f5.6. That's about par for the course. It does show a little vignetting in the corners, as does the 51.4, except more markedly this shows less vignetting, but it is still there, and it does show some chromatic aberration wide open as well. Stop down, either of these lenses, the 1.4 or the f2, stop down, and that reduces by f5.6, but I found it never completely goes away. So this lens too does have some of that chromatic aberration that the 51.4 showed. But all in all, a really, really nice lens, quite a bit cheaper than the 1.4, smaller and lighter, and that's important, so you can carry it around much more easily. And aside from that f1.4 aperture, this lens is equally capable optically. Some might say more so. That is the niceness, that is the beauty, the loveliness of the images that it makes. An absolutely delicious lens. If you haven't tried one and you're looking for a 50mm, this could be it. It's delightful. So this lens is the 55mm f3.5 that I reviewed fairly recently, actually, and this is a really nice lens. It's very sharp, it gives great colour. It doesn't make a lot of background blur, but what it does make is nice and soft. And this lens has a trick up its sleeve because it is, this will give you a clue, it's a half macro. And that's a really nice lens because that trick up its sleeve is the fact that it can take you into the world of the little tiny teeny weeny things, and that is a fascinating world to explore. This lens will take you there, and at those distances, very, very short distances that you'll be shooting at if you're doing macro photography, this lens has loads of blur, far, far, far more blur than it needs. So you'll probably end up stopping down if you're doing macro shots. Anyway, not a blur monster at longer distances, but plenty of blur close up. Let's have a closer look. So there's our 55mm half macro lens, and it's a lovely thing. It's quite a lot lighter than both the 50-1.4 and the 50 f2. You can see that when it extends, it has these macro marks on here to show you the macro measurement that you're shooting at. Here's the rear of the lens, pretty conventional, except it's got this sort of rectangular shape. Don't see that too often. Usually it's circular. There's the front of the lens. You can see again those Nikon coatings, bluey greeny type coatings, and it's a very deeply dished front element. So this lens has a lot of protection from the sun. Both the other lenses wash out in the sunshine if you're shooting directly into the sun. This one is more protected because it's got that real big shade built in. Strengths of this lens, well, it's really, 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 really sharp. f3.5 lenses are inherently sharper than those with wider apertures because that's simply how the laws of optics work. The smaller the aperture, the sharper generally the lens is. So it's very, very sharp, and it makes you an incredibly, astonishingly sharp image. I would say it's almost as sharp as a modern. That's how sharp it is. And that's wide open. So that really is saying something. It makes very, very brilliant colours. Pretty conventional colours, but quite deep, quite contrasty, quite resonant, very saturated. I love them, actually. I really like what this lens does with colour. I don't quite like it as much as what the 50 f2 does with colour. The 50 f2 keeps it very light and bright and joyous. This lens, things are a little darker, a little more contrasty, a little more serious, you might say. So that's its character. As I said, it doesn't give a lot of background blur because it's an f3.5 lens, but it will give you as much blur as any other f3.5 lens. So if you've shot a Leica Elmar, for example, this will do the same. If you've shot an Industar 50, this will give you the same amount of blur. So you can use this lens for day-to-day photography. It's really good for that. It's great for street photography, actually, because it does have that inherent sharpness, but you can use it for any other purpose that you'd use a standard 50 for, except this one goes really, really close. It's a half macro, and that's a great little trick. Very nice little lens. If you want a really good half macro, this should be on your list. Okay, here's lens number 4, and this is sitting on my Nikon FE camera. This is a camera that I really love, but this is also a lens that I really love. Let's take the filter off it so we can see it properly. And there it is on the camera, and you can see that actually first thing you can see is it's a pretty short lens. Don't forget this is an 85mm, a short telephoto, and it's not really any or really very much longer, if you note, than the 50 f2 lens. Can you see that? Yeah, can you see that? You can see that the 85mm lens is only a little bit longer than the 50mm f2 lens, so that's a real triumph of packaging. This is a very compact lens for an 85, and for that reason it's one of my favourite short telephotos. It's not particularly complex, it's not particularly fancy, it's f2, it's not particularly heavy, or it's not particularly large. So for all those reasons I really like it. But the main reasons that I really like it for are to do with the kinds of image that it can make, and it does make very beautiful images. It has something of, not quite to the same degree, but something of the colour palette that the 50 1.4 shows. That is the pumping up of blues and greens, and it does show that to some extent, though again not to as great an extent as the 50mm f1.4. It does have very nice colours, all of its own character. They are very strong, they are very resonant, they have plenty of body and depth. It's a sharp lens from wide open, at least as sharp as you can decently expect a vintage long lens to be. You won't see any particular softness, certainly in the centre of the image. Blur is very, very beautiful from this lens, and it makes a fantastic portrait lens. So you can set it to f2 wide open, get a nice sharp image of your subject, though not too sharp, not clinically sharp like a modern lens is, and beautiful soft blur in the background. And of course, because this is an 85mm lens, then it will make more blur than a 50, more blur than a shorter. Generally, you may already know this, but if you don't, generally the longer a lens's focal length, the more inherent background blur it's capable of making. Let's have a closer look at this one. So there it is. Let's check out the coatings. We've got purple kind of colour. We've also got a bluey kind of colour, so purple and bluey coatings, and that will affect the colours made by the lens, and indeed it does. It's partially responsible for giving this lens its lovely colour palette. There you can see the size of the lens. I know I keep going on about it, but it's really tiny for an 85. And then if you turn it to its minimum focus distance, it gets a little bit longer, but only by this small amount here. So this is a small lens, and it's not heavy. It's not as heavy as the 51.4. It's not quite as light as the 50 f2. It's somewhere midway between those, but it's very light for a short telly. Really quite something. How many aperture blades does it have? Let me count them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So this is a 7-bladed aperture, just the same as was the 50 f1.4. So then you will see, what are they called, septagons, if there's 7 sides. I think that's right. You will see those shapes if you stop down in your background blur. You'll get septagons in your specular highlights, which I kind of like. Wide open, they will be circular. So a really lovely lens, one of my favourite Nikon lenses actually, and one of my favourite short telephoto lenses. It's an 85mm and it's really small, and if you compare it to something, let me see now, like the Helios 40, that's an 85mm f1.5. Well now, for that half stop of aperture between f2 and f1.5, the Helios 40 is probably about 5 times as heavy as this lens. That's not an exaggeration. And it's probably about 3 or 4 times as large as well. And that's not an exaggeration. It's an enormous thing. How much better, how much more efficient, how much simpler to just have an 85 f2 like this one and keep the size down. Lovely colour, lovely blur. It makes beautiful portraits, nice and small and light. You can use it for general photography, street portraits or conventional portraits or whatever you want. A lovely, lovely lens. One of my favourite Nikons. Endlich, finally, finalement, here's a lens that I've looked at very recently, so I won't talk too much about it. In fact, I've looked at it only last week. But I did want to include it here because it's such a nice little lens. This is the Nikon 35mm f2.8, Nikon 35mm f2.8. And this, again, like the 50f2, this was a lens that was first manufactured in 1959 and it was made all the way right up to 1979. So it had a very, very long production run. And it demonstrates really well Nikon's policy of not creating different lenses, but improving the lenses that they have. A little bit like Porsche used to do with the 911 or Saab used to do with the 900. And it's a really effective production method because it means that you don't have to retool, you don't have to keep spending extra costs on new lenses. You can just improve the one you've got. And this one went through, gosh, at least 5 different iterations before it got to this one. This is one of the later ones. It's 73 to 78, apparently, according to the serial number. It's a beautiful little lens. Let's have a closer look. So there it is. The coatings we can see there seem to be of the blue persuasion. I can't see any purple or bronzy coloured coatings on there. A very small front element, and generally a very small and light lens. This, I think, is one that's been in somebody's personal collection for a while. It's clearly not been misused. It's not got any marks or dings or dents on it, and you can see from this splodge of sticky that it's had its past sticker on up until fairly recently. Apertures run from f2.8 to f22. There's the rear of the lens with the Nikon F mount that didn't change right the way from 1959 until, as I understand it, the present day. So any Nikon camera will shoot any Nikon lens, as I understand it. Do let me know if that's not correct. This lens did really well in a comparison with my Carl Zeiss Jena Flektogon 35mm f2.4, and that lens is my gold standard for 35mm vintage lenses. There may well be a better one, but I haven't found it yet. Having said that, I've not shot too many vintage 35s, but of the 35s I've shot, the Carl Zeiss Jena Flektogon is on top, no question about it. This lens did very, very well when I pitched it against it. It didn't quite beat it, and it didn't quite equal it, except for sharpness. Again, this is all very subjective. I don't do pixel peeping tests on lenses because we don't do that when we look at images. When we look at images, we look with our subjective eye. We don't start delving into the tiny technicalities. So that's how I review the lenses on this channel. And without pixel peeping, this lens is easily as sharp as the Carl Zeiss Jena wide open. That's quite an achievement because that's a very sharp lens. So this gives very, very sharp images right from wide open, and you can shoot it wide open all day long. Of course, you don't buy a 35mm for creating background blur. That's not the uppermost thought in your mind, but this one will make a little blur, especially at its closest focus distance, which is 30 centimeters. So this goes pretty close. It'll focus down to about that far, the length of a ruler, 1 foot or 30 centimeters. So that's really nice, and it will make plenty of blur at that distance. This is a great lens for street photography. It's a great lens for general photography. It will make a nice portrait, but you'd need to go pretty close if you want to make any background blur, so it's probably not ideal for that. But street, landscape, architecture, any other kind of photography you can think of, this lens will lend itself to it, but is perhaps primarily most suited to street work. I think that's where it naturally fits. So it's nice and sharp from wide open. It will give you some nice background blur, especially at closer distances, and it gives very nice colour too. They're quite solid, they're quite resonant, they've got plenty of saturation, depth and strength, and generally I like the colours that this lens makes. It's not particularly warm, it's not particularly cool, it just seems to be probably around about neutral for colour temperature. A very, very nice lens that I really enjoyed shooting. It didn't quite manage to knock my CZJ Flectagon off its top spot, but what it did do, and this surprised me, was beat the Olympus 35mm f2.8, and it really trounced it actually. It wasn't any sharper, but it did give nicer colours, and it does have much better rather contrast, so you get much stronger images. The Zuiko images, the Olympus images seemed a little bit washed out by comparison. So generally this is one of the nicer 35mm vintage lenses I've shot. Really lovely optic, all metal. If you look after it, like all of these lenses, it will last until you're old and grey. Okay, so that is 5 really nice Nikon lenses of the old school vintage variety, all made of metal, all really good lenses, all optically fantastic. They range from 35mm right the way up to 85mm, so whatever kind of focal length you're looking for, there is one of these Nikon lenses that will suit it. So I guess that is about it from me for today. I'm going to go and nurse my cold because it's pretty horrible. I hope you've enjoyed watching this show. I hope you found it entertaining, and I hope it's given you some information. If you've enjoyed this show, please do chuck us a sub. That would really be appreciated. Many, many thanks go to subscribers for your support. That is really appreciated. And many, many thanks go to patrons for your support. That is very much appreciated. Thank you to everybody who's watched, looked in, come back, subscribed, given thanks, given super thanks, or engaged with the channel in any way. Many, many thanks for your views and your visits and your support. Everything is really appreciated. As for me, that is about it for now. So if you're not doing anything too irksome, awkward or difficult next week at around this time, please do join me for a spot more Zenography. Cheerio all.